Welcome back, friends. So, I definitely am kind of profiting off this whole Napoleon thing going on, but I thought today would be cool to go into something which I've actually noticed there are not a lot of videos on YouTube about, and that is none other than one of the main things in the beginning of the Napoleon trailer, and that would be the guillotine. As she serves you, Madame Guillotine, slice from paradise. Hail Her Majesty, Madame Guillotine. Alright, you guys. First things first. A big shout out to Nan Knighton's Scarlet Pimpernel. The Scarlet Pimpernel is it's actually a book written by Baroness Orsiski about a English aristocrat who tries to rescue people during the Reign of Terror. But that's what that music and clips were from the musical, but also from the Scarlet Pimpernel movies. So just wanted to give that a shout out because I love that soundtrack and it's a great song. But when we think about the guillotine, we always think about, chopping off heads and things of that nature. But the thing is, we had been doing it for centuries up to this point. Decapitation was actually a very common style of execution, usually used for aristocrats and people of higher standing. During the Middle Ages, it was usually by axe or sword beheadings. Peasants were usually hung, but it was very common. But something happened, and it was not always the cleanest. It was not always the easiest way. A perfect example, in fact, would be that of Mary, Queen of Scots. When Mary, Queen of Scots was executed by the British government of her cousin, of all people, she actually, the first strike did not successfully cut her head off. She was actually hit twice by the executioner's axe, which proved to be cruel. So around the world, everyone started trying to figure out a better way of execution, of beheading. And actually, there was a precursor to the guillotine in England, of all places, called the Halifax gibbet. Now, the Halifax gibbet is actually very, very similar to the guillotine. The only difference is instead of having the flat blade, it was actually just a weighted axe blade that would come down on the head. Again, this was mainly used for nobility, aristocrats, and so on. This was not meant to be used for the lower classes or anything like that. But as I said before, you had around the world people trying to figure out how to perfect the style of execution, to make it more humane. This is the Enlightenment. This is the era of trying to figure out how to make things better. So now, as we move a little more forward in history, we come to the late 1700s, and we come to a certain man named Antoine Louis. Now, Antoine Louis was a physiologist, and he, with a German engineer named Tobias Schmidt, built a prototype to a guillotine. And actually, it's ironic because their original style was very similar to the Halifax gibbet. But it was said by Charles Henri Sanson, who would be the chief executioner of France for a while, that it was Louis XVI himself, the King of France, who gave the idea of doing the straight blade with the wedge in it, as it would be easier to cut. But it was the king himself who, sadly, would be responsible for the future use. But it didn't all happen quickly. What had happened was Louis XVI had, in fact, outstretched France by aiding us in the by aiding the United States in the American Revolution. Though he helped defeat Great Britain, he put his own country in debt. Now, Louis was in charge of what was known as the Ancien Regime, which was something based from his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, a pretty much authoritarian rule of France, pretty much. The king had not called what was known as a States General for almost, I believe, 150 years at this point. But Louis, with France's economy crashing, needed to call an Estates General. So that's what he did in 1789, calling an Estates General of the three estates: the nobility, the clergy, and the normal lower class. This didn't, in fact, work in his favor, as now with all of these people together in one location, the third estate and members of both the aristocratic estate and the clergy decided enough was enough, and they wanted to form a new government, an actual assembly, the same as the United States had, or Great Britain had, or even some of the continental nations who had constitutional monarchies. Now, two things happened. Louis's finance minister, Jacques Necker, kind of was angling Louis towards agreeing with this idea of a new constitutional monarchy to give the people their rights. Louis disagreed. In fact, Louis and his siblings saw this as a direct threat to the monarchy. And being many French soldiers he felt he could not trust, nor could he trust Necker himself, he made a very faulty decision. And in 1789, he dismissed Necker and called upon Swiss and German soldiers to come occupy Paris to keep the peace. Now, clearly, one thing, Necker was actually beloved by the Parisians. They thought he had their best interest at heart, which he did. He himself was Swiss, but he had become kind of a friend to the people of Paris. So with his removal and the arrival of what many Parisians saw as foreign troops, the Parisians rose up. And on July 14th, 1789, after they attacked and stormed the Hotel des Invalides, they marched to the Bastille in Paris, storming it, taking it, and killing the governor, Delaunay, in the process. Now, what this will do is one of two things. Well, this would cause two things to happen. First, it would bring the introduction of the National Guard to France, which would be led by the Marquis de Lafayette, who was the hero of two worlds at this point, as now he was a leader of the French Revolution. But it would also bring upon the assembly the creation of the National Assembly, which would have all three estates meet together, and each estate, instead of the way the Estates General was set up, each person's vote would count as one. Now we get brought to the real person in this, the real name behind this creation, Joseph Ignace Guillotine. Now, he was a physician, but he had also come to the National Assembly with the idea to use this creation of Louis and Schmidt as a more humane way of execution. Now, if we look at a guillotine, it's a very simple contraption. We have the bed, you have the scaffold where the neck will go, and usually there'll be a basket. Obviously in this image there is no basket because we really can't see. But what will happen is the head will go into the scaffold, the blade will be lifted up, and the weight of the blade will drop, severing the head from the body. The blade would be razor sharp, and due to the wedge positioning of the blade, it would simply just slice through. Very simple, very easy, and very quick. The whole point here is they wanted to make sure you didn't suffer. And this was to be used for all criminals, aristocrats, clergy, third estate, even soldier, anyone. This was to be used for. So the assembly decided, okay, well, we need an example. We need to make sure this works before we continue anything, before we agree that this should be the way of execution. So, the first execution by this new device would be performed on the 25th of April, 1792, on a man named Nicolas Jacques Pelletier. He was a highwayman who had been arrested and found guilty of his crimes, among other things, and was sentenced to death. So, the first guillotine would be built in front of the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. Now, this is where it will remain for a while, but we will talk about that later in the video of what happens. But it would be placed there for this first execution. It would be a public execution, as most executions were. And the chief executioner of France, Charles-Henri Sanson, would be chosen to lead the execution. So, everything went according to plan. They hooked Pelletier up to the contraption, and it was a success. Now, this was good news, but also now, as the revolution is dragging on, things are becoming more dangerous for the nobility in France. The Jacobins in Paris have been able to convince the Parisians to rise up and attack everyone else. You know, this is not something good that is going on. This is, this is not the revolution that many aristocrats like the Marquis de Lafayette was seeing. And then on August 10th, 1792, only about 2 months later, the Parisians will storm the Tuileries Palace where the King and Queen of France resided. The King and Queen would exit protected by the National Assembly and brought to the National Assembly building. However, the King's Swiss Guard would be abandoned and left to fend for themselves. Many Swiss Guard will be massacred, and a plaque and monument still stand to honor those Swiss Guard killed that day. But also, this would bring on the end of the French monarchy. King Louis would tell his son, Charles, and look at him at the National Assembly on this day and say to his son, there is no longer a king in France. This day, the National Assembly would be officially the only government of France. Now, one of their first actions as a republic would be to arrest the former king and queen, Marie Antoinette, and imprison them in the Temple Palace prison in Paris. Another thing that would happen would be the radical group, the Jacobins, would rise to power in the new National Assembly. Now, usually this is something we think of as, oh, it's just a political party, nothing to be worried about, nothing to be concerned about. But the Jacobins, because of their control over Paris, made them a threat. And this also ushered in the rise of the infamous Maximillian Robespierre. Now, Robespierre was a lawyer from actually the French countryside who had come to Paris as a deputy during the Estates General. But he had risen to prominence through his speeches and sensibility. And he knew how to ride the waves and side with people. And because of this, he rose to a very high place in the new French government, including becoming a member of the Committee of Public Safety, which would soon control France as a dictatorship with Robespierre in charge. Robespierre, along with Louis Saint-Just and Georges Couthon, would lead and begin the Reign of Terror, which would engulf France, using the guillotine, or what now was becoming known as the National Razor, against who they deemed enemies of France. The first victims of the Reign of Terror would be the king and queen themselves, executed in front of the Hôtel de Ville, in front of crowds of thousands who cheered their death. But they would not be the first, because while this is all going on, right before Louis was executed, he had started a war with Austria as well as the other nobility in France, called the War of the First Coalition, which France was having a very tough time fighting and holding their own against the combined might of Europe. It was under these pressures that Louis Saint-Just would say to the National Assembly, terror must be the order of the day. And with that, the Hotel de Ville became the most popular spot in Paris. Day after day, for the duration of the Reign of Terror, 17,000 people would be guillotined. So many people would be guillotined that Sanson would actually lose count and be exhausted day after day leading the executions. It was terror that no one had ever seen before. Thousands upon thousands executed, some on trumped up charges, some who'd done nothing wrong. Even allies of Robespierre and Saint-Just and Couthon would be sent to the guillotine for crimes that were just as blatant as witch trial crimes. All you had to say was my neighbor wasn't revolutionary or he was counter-revolutionary, and they would find themselves at the guillotine. The arduous track would also be given to many nobles who were seen as counter-revolutionary, being carried on carts all the way to the Hotel de Ville. But it was at this point that something else happened, something terrifying actually. The guillotine was used so much that it was actually dropping property value, and the Hotel de Ville was smelling. So instead of stopping executions, they moved it to Place de la Révolution, where a monument of justice watched as people were so injusticely executed back to back. The reign, though, would end finally on the 9th of Thermidor. That was the day, the fall of Robespierre. Robespierre would come to the National Assembly after many members of the Committee of Public Safety were starting to denounce him, Couthon and Saint-Just, as well as their other Jacobins. And what ended up happening was he tried to make a plea directly to the full assembly and try to expulge certain members. But all that ended up happening was the entire assembly turned against him, as at this point he had become, in their eyes, a tyrant and dictator. So what he did was he retreated to Hotel de Ville with members of the Paris National Guard. However, things did not go in his favor, and he and his conspirators were captured. Himself, having been shot in the jaw, would have to wear a gauze to hold his face together. And he himself would be executed on July 28th, 1794, at the Place de la Révolution. This would finally bring an end to the Reign of Terror. He and his conspirators were all executed one by one. And people cheered as they did when King Louis and Marie Antoinette were also executed. Now, what happens next in French history is very well known. Napoleon Bonaparte would rise to power, the wars of the other coalitions would happen, as well as the fall of Napoleon, followed by the Bourbon Restoration, which would then be followed by the July regime, which would be followed by the Second Republic, which would be followed by the Second Empire, and so on. But this entire time that this is happening, the guillotine is still the national execution device of France. It would be used very, very late into French history. And it would also be public. The last public execution in France will be in June of 1939. A man named Eugene Weidmann was a German criminal and was executed publicly in front of his prison in France. Now, this also was finally when the French government said, we can't be doing these public executions anymore. Because, one, it brought out the worst of people, but also the amount of time it took to, first of all, set up the guillotine, bring it out, get everyone ready, then the crowds would show up, and then the actual horror of doing it. So after Huguenin's death, it was decided that all further guillotinings would happen in private. They would happen in the prisons where no one would see, as most executions in the modern day would. Now, the last guillotining in France will happen September 10th, 1977, to a man named Hamada Jadoubi. This will be the last execution by guillotine ever in France. Now, I want to put this in retrospect for everyone. Star Wars A New Hope had premiered 3 months before the final execution by guillotine in France. I thought that's a very interesting fact a lot of people don't realize. That is how recent the last execution by guillotine was. A New Hope was premiered when the last guillotine's blade fell. The guillotine has had quite a history. The guillotine is one of the most noticeable, most known, most chilling symbols in world history. The sign of revolution, the sign of overthrowing tyranny, but also the sign of terror. As Saint-Just once said, terror will be the order of the day. And the guillotine was the blade in which that order was cut. Thank you so much for joining me. I know this is a weird version. I'm trying out something new in this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a comment, like, share, and comment if you enjoyed. Please subscribe if you're new to the channel. I always appreciate the new viewers. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thanks again. Have a good one.